All right, everybody. Welcome back to the second week of Science Versus. So, we heard your cries, your pleas, your needs for environmental science versus engineering. So, representing the environmental sciences, we're going to have Megan, and representing engineering and robotics, we're going to have Andy. So, first up, I'll introduce Megan Sullivan. She grew up in Massillon, Ohio, but has called Libreville, Gabon her home for the past 3 years. She dropped out of art school after taking botanical drawing classes and is a certified wilderness first responder. In other words, she knows how to save a life miles from medical care. So if you break your leg out there in the wilderness, she's got your back. And once she even fixed broken brakes on her field car with only pliers and a hammer. So this person knows how to survive. Thank you and welcome, Megan. Woo! All right. And in our other corner, we have Andy the Mustang Morgan. Andy hails from Youngstown, Ohio, stands at 1,930.04 millimeters of pure robotic man. He almost flunked kindergarten and still can't tell the difference between red and green because guess what? He's colorblind. So, fun fact. He broke his left collarbone 3 times before the age of 11 and has once even completed the 4-pound Euro challenge at the age of 14. And according to him, 'twas the best and worst decision of his life. So with that, thank you, competitors. We look forward to hearing your talks, and we're going to flip a coin right now to figure out who's going to go first. So I pass it off to Heather. All right, Andrew, Megan, who's going to be heads, who's going to be tails? Since I introduced Megan first, Andy, why don't you tell us, do you want heads or tails?
I'm going to go with heads.
All right, Heather, flip that coin. All right, Andy gets to go first because he got heads. So, do any of you have anything that you want to say to each other before we start this battle?
Yeah, I just have one thing to say. I really hope you don't do anything to undercut the friendly competition, Megan.
Wow, a cut at the plants. I see how it is. What about you, Megan? You got anything to throw back at Andy?
I just hope Andy can, get a grip and he doesn't, mess up or anything on his presentation.
Ooh, making a cut at the robotics hands. I see how it is. Okay. All right. So let's get this started. I hope we all have a clean fight, and we'll start off with Andy.
So hello, everyone, and thank you very much for attending the Flip Science Fair for the fall of 2020. This is the second Flip Science Fair of this fall semester. Today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about robotics. More specifically, I'm going to highlight sort of the holy grail of robotics, robots assisting humans. My name is Andy Morgan. I am a 4th-year PhD student in mechanical engineering here at Yale University, and I'm very excited to be talking to you today about robots. So I always sort of want to start off the whole idea of where does the term robot come from? We're so used to hearing the term robot in our present day society, and we really sort of want to have a better understanding of where this term came from. So the term robot was actually first introduced in a playwright back in 1920, written by Karel Capek. And it was a play called Rossum's Universal Robots. It was incredibly popular in 1920. It was written, and by 1923, it was translated into 30 different languages. So what it actually showed or depicted were these robots being made in factories to do tasks that humans didn't really want to do. Tasks like washing dishes or mowing the lawn, sort of the chores that you try to put off in your everyday life. And as these robots got better and better, they were able to do our chores amazing. They were really good at doing these chores, but they also were able to start thinking for themselves and start communicating. And as with any good play, the robots start communicating and they start figuring out how to take over the world. So the big overarching question is this where we are now? Are we at the point where robots are sort of communicating with one another and being able to figure out how to figure out what they could do against humans. Really, and I want to assure you that we aren't quite there yet, and we're still a long ways away. So the big question is, where are we now? So when we think of robots, we actually think of maybe the science fiction depictions of what a robot is. Maybe it is Baymax from Big Hero 6, or maybe Sonny from the movie I, Robot, or maybe even sort of something like the Terminator. But I assure you, these, in some regards, the Baymax, big fluffy robot, or these very complicated robots such as the Terminator, we are not there yet. But where we are robots like the Roomba, where the Roomba is a vacuum cleaner that's able to basically map out what your floor plans look like in your home. And according to what your floor plans look like, it's able to explore and find places that may have some dust bunnies laying around. Or we have robots such as drones that you're able to go to your local Best Buy or Walmart and pick up. And by all terms and all definitions of the term robot, these are what we consider robots in our current everyday life. But they're not nearly as complex as what we see Baymax or the Terminator or Sonny from iRobot being. So I want to sort of shed some light into what research in robotics currently is at, and give you an idea of maybe where we're headed with robots. So first, I want to show you this robotic hand. Now, this robotic hand is something they call being anthropomorphic, which means that the hand it looks like a human hand. Now, what this hand is doing is it has a goal, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And using various machine learning practices, this hand has learned to control the orientation or the rotation of the cube during this, what we would call within-hand manipulation. And when you think of within-hand manipulation, it's no more than being able to change the position of the cube while only being within the hand. Now, this is actually learned with machine learning, as I noted, with over 100 years of simulated data. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's not actually 100 years of data they accumulated. But what they did is they were able to run this on different computers at the same time and collect data that is equivalent to running this for over 100 years. We also have robots that have gotten really good at what we call locomotion, or being able to walk. So when you look at this robot, you might say, hey, this in a way sort of looks like a human. It has 2 legs, it has 2 arms, and maybe there's actually a human in it. I assure you there's no human actually in that robot. But it's able to do things that we as humans could do, like walk and jump, and maybe if you want to be so good as to actually do a backflip. Pretty amazing, huh? So moving on from the humanoid robot, we have robots that we sort of call dogs. Robots that have 4 legs. Robots that are able to sense their environment, figure out what is going on around them. In this case, this robot dog realizes that it needs to open a door. So it communicates with another robot dog that has a robot arm on it. And the other robot dog is able to sense where the door handle is. It is able to pull the door handle while holding the door open, and then let the original robot dog in. So these are all very robust interactions. And when I say interactions, I really mean how we change the environment around us. And robots are actually getting pretty good at it. And in some ways, these interactions of how we change our setting, when I say the environment of a robot, I'm not necessarily talking about what the weather's like outside or if it's raining. When I talk about environment, I really mean what is around us. Is there a water bottle sitting next to you, or maybe a computer mouse? This is all what I refer to as being a robot in its environment, or a human in its environment. So robots are getting better at interacting with our environment, but how can they better assist humans? So I actually want to introduce you to a roboticist, an MIT professor named Hugh Hare. He actually is missing both of his legs. And what he has set out to do with a lot of his research is to actually develop better prosthetics for four-legged robots. So by all ways that you could actually define the term robot, his legs are essentially robots in and of themselves. They communicate with one another. So according to how he wants to walk, or when his muscles of the residual limb actually say, hey, we should move, the motors inside of the robotic leg move according to how his brain is telling the muscles to move. And you can see here, the way he walks looks very natural to a human. And according to how he wants to walk, the robots are actually talking back and forth and making sure that that they're moving in coordinated fashion. So now I've sort of talked about these really cool things and that's going on in robotics, and maybe some that are probably a little bit more futuristic. And I've talked a little bit about the settings and the environments of robots. But I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it for a couple seconds. How do humans, pretend that word is do, how do humans normally interact with their environments? So think about that for a couple seconds. Well, humans typically interact with their environment in several ways. One, we can typically move around in the environment. But the answer I'm actually looking for in this question is actually our hands. When you think of ways that we can help prevent the spread of COVID, everyone says, hey, wash your hands. Well, it's because we are always interacting by touch. We are grabbing our toothbrush in the morning to brush our teeth. We're opening door handles. We are typing on a keyboard. You're typing in the chat right now. So the way we interact with our environment a lot of times has to do with our hands. And this is an immensely complicated body part. In fact, the reason why humans have developed the brains that we have today are because of how able our hands are to do very specific things. Now, I don't want to get too far into it, but what actually distinguishes our hands from apes is the fact that our hands could do this. Apes could only do this, where they can only touch the tips of their fingertips between their index finger and their thumb, where humans could do this. And this has allowed us to interact with objects in many different ways. So say we want a robot to do sort of the task we talked about earlier, like folding clothes or doing dishes. How do we do that? Well, the truth is humans are actually incredibly messy. How many of you have bedrooms that actually look like this? Have you not done laundry for the past 2 weeks? Have you not cleaned up after you took that last shirt off? And if we want to be able to expect a robot to actually interact with their environment, in this case, interacting with the environment would be, hey, let's fold some clothes, or let's pick up these clothes to do laundry. Well, every single shirt you have is made of a different material compared to maybe the pair of pants you have. And being able to fold those two different articles of clothing require different motions from the robot. Because if you're trying to fold jeans, the material is much stiffer than that of, say, a t-shirt. Now, say for instance, maybe you forgot to do dishes for the past 2 weeks. Well, if you want a robot to do the dishes, it's going to have to be able to sense exactly where each cup is, what is a fork in this picture, maybe where is the extra food that's on the plate. Maybe it misclassifies what food is on the plate as being a utensil. So these are all like the big questions that we talk about in robotics, that being able to perceive and sense the environment, what is happening, and then being able to actually make the decisions to act upon it is really difficult. Because let's face it, houses are not like warehouses where things are stacked appropriately in their correlated bins, or maybe in a robot factory where everything is sorted according to where it needs to be. So humans are incredibly messy, and the way that we are able to overcome that is really through our hands. So I want to show you a video. This is a video of a human hand, actually my hand, doing the task of juggling, they call it boating balls, traditional Chinese boating balls. And if you look real slow of the contacts that are being made and broken during these tasks, it's incredibly difficult. So on the left here, I have a robot hand that is doing within hand manipulation like we talked about earlier, and then a human hand that is being able to manipulate or reorient an apple. So these really rich contexts, these very complex movements that the human hand is able to do allows us to do a lot of these tasks that are very difficult for robots. So how do we overcome that? Well, one way we have sort of tried to address this is something that I work on during my PhD, is something called the Yale Openhand project. And what we try to do is we actually try to design robotic hands that are able to do some of these cooler tasks that human hands are able to do. But we don't necessarily require that they look like human hands. In fact, we have hands that only have 2 fingers that are really good at grasping objects. We have hands that have 3 fingers that are good at grasping, but also pretty good at actually doing the within hand manipulation I was talking about earlier. We have hands with 4 fingers. We have hands that don't even look like hands at all, but are actually really good at doing very specific tasks. And if we actually want robots to be able to function in our very human-made, unstructured environments, such as, like I said, cleaning up, doing the dishes, or maybe cleaning up your bedroom, we need to actually design robots that are capable of doing such things. And we could really get into the nitty-gritty of this, but it really comes down to we use math in various ways to sort of define how a robot hand should be able to move in order to be designed for different tasks. Now, I won't get too far into that, but I will show you a couple examples of things that we've been able to do. So I want to show you this robotic hand that actually is actually completing the task of juggling bowling balls, like I showed earlier, where on the right we have bowling balls and on the left we have a golf ball and a squash ball. Now, this hand was actually designed to be able to do something called caging, which essentially, while it is moving around, it doesn't allow the balls inside of the hand to be ejected during the manipulation process. So it allows us to do some sort of cool things like juggling on top of a tabletop instead of just in a static position. We've also designed hands that are able to do, again, what we call within hand manipulation. So if you look at the marker that's on top of the objects, we have an apple, Rubik's Cube, and actually a toy drill. We're actually trying to trace the letters RAL, which is the name of a journal that we are submitting to, with the markers on top of the object. So you could kind of think of this as doing quote unquote handwriting with the robot. And then finally, I sort of want to show a video of how humans often manipulate objects and how we have overcome this with different robot practices. So if you were to pick up a coin or an index card, the human hand and a human in general would typically on top of put your hand on top of the object and slide it towards you to grasp. Well, similar to that idea, we want to be able to teach robots with machine learning how to be able to slide objects and then grasp them. So this is us actually doing this with the letters YALE to spell out Yale for a publication. So I sort of just want to end here with the question I started with earlier. Are we really at the point where robots are going to take over the world like in that play I talked about? Are we really at the point where robots are going to be able to do your dishes or do your laundry or mow the lawn and do all the chores that you've been putting off during quarantine? At this point, the answer really is no, but we do have some capable robots that, like Roombas, that are able to vacuum. We have some capable robots such as drones that you're able to use for photography and for enjoyment. But we still really do have a long way to go. And the future of robotics is incredibly bright, and we're really excited to see what comes in the following years. So to end, I just want to thank my lab, the robotics group at Yale, the National Science Foundation for my funding, along with my professor, a postdoc I work with, and a fellow graduate student. So I know I am the first presenter, but I do always like to end with this slide that I'm excited to answer any questions that you guys have in our Q&A session at the end of Megan's talk. So thank you.
Awesome. That was a great talk, Andy. If you are a participant, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A, and Andy, you can either directly respond to them or we'll deal with them in the Q&A session at the very end. I am very inspired by watching your talk. Honestly, The Matrix is one of my favorite movies, so it makes me feel better that the robot wars are not upon us, but I do really appreciate my Roomba. So with that, the poll should be opening soon. All right, thank you all so much for your feedback on Andy's talk. So from the world of robotics, we're going to move out into the wild wilderness of environmental science with Megan, or Mama Gran, Sullivan.
My name is Megan Sullivan. I'm a PhD candidate in the Yale School of Forestry, and I study selective logging in tropical forests. I do my work in Gabon. So Gabon is a country in Central Africa. It's on the equator, and Gabon is really well known for having lush forests, super beautiful. This is a waterfall that is visited a lot of the time by tourists, and there's also a lot of wildlife there. So for example, elephants, forest elephants are one of the kind of species that you might see in Gabon. They're super interesting, and they're only in West and Central Africa. So where I work in Central Africa, you can see them all the time. And studying tropical forests is super important and really interesting. So one of the things you can study tropical forests for is for impact reduction. There are a lot of different companies that use the forest, like logging companies that cut trees so that they can sell them and make money. And so studying the forest can help us understand how to reduce the harmful impacts of logging to make the operations as sustainable as possible. Can also give information about forests that we study to people like in the government who do some types of land use planning, so they can decide which forest to cut and which forests to preserve or keep as like land for people to use. And also studying forests is really important for climate change. Climate change is when there's an excess of carbon dioxide in the air and the world gets hotter, rainfall patterns change, and it disrupts ecosystems across the world. And so if we study forests, trees store a lot of carbon, and that can help mitigate climate change. So studying forests is super important for a lot of really interesting reasons. And the part of tropical forest that I study is logging. So selective logging is really different than what most people think of logging. When most people think of logging, I think they think of clear cutting. Clear cutting is when the entirety of the forest is cut, so like all of the trees, and they just leave a giant bare patch where the forest used to be. And that's in this picture on the left here. Selective logging, I've shown in this picture in the middle, and you can see that the little red outlined holes are where the trees that they cut were. So in selective logging, they only select a couple trees and then they take them out of the forest. And so then I have the picture of no cutting, where you can see that the forest has not been cut at all. And so the no cutting picture is a lot closer to selective logging than the clear cutting is to the no cutting picture. So it sort of helps so that the logging isn't so harmful to the environment. And like I said, selective logging only cuts selected high-value timber species, so only the ones that when you cut them and sell them, you're going to make a lot of money. They only cut super big trees, and they decide which trees to cut by like mapping all the trees. So I put a picture of a map down here. And if all the blue trees are trees, but not ones that they'd cut, and the red ones are ones that they'd cut, that would help people make decisions about where to like cut roads into the forest and things like that. When people are logging, they need to build infrastructure and cut these roads in. So they like make a camp for the workers, some garage for their machinery, and like a sawmill or other processing facilities for the woods. And when you do research about where to cut the trees in advance, roads can be strategically placed to minimize damage based on where the trees are in the forest. Cutting down trees can be done so that the forest is minimally harmed. They can control the direction of the tree fall, and cutting the lianas or vines that sort of like wrap around the tree so that the trees don't pull down other trees with them. And they cut skid trails. So in the bottom photo, there's sort of the relic of an old skid trail. And those are what they use to pull out the trees from the forest. And if they can minimize the area where they put the skid trails, then that helps conserve the canopy or the adult trees that are overhead in the forest. While the trees are being cut in one block, so for example, this whole colorful rainbow area is an example of a logging concession, which just means an area of land where a logging company can cut. They'll only cut sort of like one little block per year. So for example, if they cut the blue block in 2020, then maybe in 2021, they'll cut the pink block. And so they can go through the logging concession really slowly and work through. And then by the time they get back to cutting the blue block, the trees will have had time to grow again and recover. But the company can still cut down trees in other parts of the logging concession and maintain profitable activity and keep giving people jobs, which is pretty cool. So selective logging, like I said, just to illustrate the process, you have a forest, you go into it, look for timber species, clear roads, and build infrastructure. You cut down your selected tree species, and then you wait 20 to 40 years for regrowth, and then you can start the process all over again. So it's a much more sustainable process than normal logging or like clear cutting, and keeps a lot of the forest intact so that plants and animals have their homes and places to live, and don't get driven out of certain areas. But forests after they're cut have a lot of different changes. So after a forest is cut, it's called a secondary forest. And you can see that in the secondary forest that was recently cut, so the picture on the left side, there is a lot of light that wasn't there before, but then the forest will regrow over time. And in the picture on the right, there's not a lot of light in the background, and the forest environment goes back to being more similar to what it was before it was logged, which is pretty dark, actually. And what I focus on when I'm considering how does logging affect tropical forests, I look at how logging affects seedling competition. So there are two different layers in the forest. There's a canopy layer with adult tree species, and there's an understory layer with the seedlings. And one of the reasons that we study seedlings is because they represent what the future forest is going to be. They're like the baby trees that are going to grow up to become the adult trees in the future. And when a seedling is sort of thinking about what they're going to do and how they can survive and grow and become those adult trees in the forest, there are kind of like two different strategies. So can a seedling invest in lots of energy for growth? Like I said, tropical forests are pretty dark. So if you happen to be in a little patch of sunlight in the understory of the canopy, and you can grow really fast, that's super advantageous, and you're going to have a good chance of growing up to be an adult tree. But in the dark understory of the canopy, there's also a lot of stuff that attacks seedlings. So for example, pathogens can make seedlings sick and cause them to die. There's also insects and things like rodents or deer or other animals that will eat seedlings, and then that causes them to die and they won't become adult tree species either. So when you're a seedling, you're growing in the forest. If you get a lot of sun, you're going to survive just fine. All of the seedlings can get tons of sun. That's great. But for seedlings in a tropical forest, it's not so easy because the canopy layer is very thick and doesn't let in a lot of sunlight. So the tree species that don't get enough light are going to die and they won't be able to survive. So only those tree species that can capture that light and then grow really fast are the ones that are going to be able to survive. But there's also that other pressure that I talked about, the enemies that attack different types of seedlings. So you have all these seedlings in the understory of the forest. There are these pathogens and insects and rodents that attack the plants. And if you're not a plant that has invested in some sort of protective strategy, like plants can produce chemicals that taste really bad so that insects or rodents won't want to eat them. If you haven't invested in that strategy, you're not protected from those things and you're going to die. And only the few species that have invested in protection from all of these natural enemies are going to be the ones who survive and win out. And so this is, like I said, a really big dilemma for seedlings, because a seedling only has so much energy. Seedlings get energy from the sun and they take up nutrients from the soil and get water from rain to produce sugars that allow them to grow and produce all these protective chemicals and survive. But seedlings are such tiny little plants, they can't grow and protect themselves and do everything they want all at the same time. And so choosing between these strategies is kind of a big factor. The way that we determine what strategy these plants are looking at in the forest understory is we set up we draw out these little squares in the forest, and we measure the vegetation community through a network of seedling plots. And so we go into the forest, we trace out this square, and then we tag and measure everything inside the square. And then over time, we go back and we visit the same plots and mark whether the species are still alive or whether they've died since the last time we've been there, to see which plants are doing better in logged and unlogged forests, to see if there's any differences. And we take a bunch of measurements. Like I said, we measure adult tree species and seedlings. So the little seedlings, we measure the heights of them on the ground. And then the adult tree species, we measure the width of them, so all the way around, and they can get really big. Like I said, we tag them and we number them. So you can see this picture on the top right. We have one of our little tree tags. Every tree tag has a number, and then we identify those species so we can give them all names. And we measure their widths. So we paint these little red marks on them to see so that when we go back, we're always measuring them in the same place and comparing the same parts of the trees. And we also measure other aspects of of the plants. So see, plants have different sizes of seeds. That's my colleague Prince, and he's holding this big seed pod with these giant seeds in them. But there are also seeds that are very small and are, you know, they're not as big, they're not as able to survive on their own. And how we put all this information together is, so there's more light in logged forests. And so this is probably going to give an advantage to all of those species that can grow really well and grow really fast if there's a lot of light. And this is a really interesting thing because if there are more species that grow faster in the high light of environment of a forest that has been logged, the types of tree species that survive are going to be tree species that grow really fast, store a lot less carbon, and have smaller wind or explosively dispersed seeds. Whereas the plants that usually grow in unlogged forests that have a low light environment and are the type of seedlings that invest in protection, they grow really slowly, store a lot more carbon, and they have larger animal dispersed seeds. And I have one picture, this video, which is kind of cool. This is a mandrill who depends on these seeds, these really big seeds. That's a seed that he just picked up in the forest because they eat them for food. So if you're logging a forest and all of a sudden you get all of these really fast growing species that don't produce seeds for animals, then it's going to make it really hard for the animals to get all the food that they need because these different tree species are growing in these forests that have been logged. And so that's why I study the seedlings in the forest, because they tell us what tree species are going to be the future forests of tomorrow. And it gives us an idea of what the environment is going to be like for plants, animals, and also humans that use the forest in the places where these things are occurring. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was a really cool talk. I love how both your talk and Andy's talk are looking towards the future, whether that's preserving what we have for the future or building new things for the future. So I will once again ask all the participants to participate in the poll, answer the same questions, but for Megan's talk, and then we will get to the Q&A and results. So Deandra will be moderating this session between Megan and Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Once again, those were two really, really great talks. I just want to echo what Delphina said. It's really great to hear how different fields are looking towards the future. And during both talks, we've got a lot of great questions for you. And so these aren't all of them, but hopefully we get to the ones that were the highest voted. And so I'll start with Andrew. The first question I have is it possible in any way to make robots that have emotion, or in other words, any other sort of types of consciousness?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Especially when we talk about robotics, we're always thinking about what may be possible in the future. And while sort of programming emotions isn't really anything that we have really dove into quite yet, it is definitely something that researchers are always thinking about. Like, there's something, we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, and that is more or less the way of a robot being able to make decisions sort of similar to that of a human. That is really the goal in AI. But there's also something that was introduced back in as early as the 1950s, 1960s called artificial psychology, where we're trying to actually develop robots that may be able to think like humans, not just make decisions like humans. So while that's something that isn't as needed quite yet, because we don't have robots that are out in our everyday society, that is something that roboticists and people that develop these robots have been thinking about for quite some time.
And I can definitely think of so many positives to have robots that have emotions, thinking about the Roomba and, chasing a cat that doesn't seem to like the Roomba very much. Maybe if the Roomba knew to turn the other way, it would be great if the robot could feel that. And on the same idea of programming, Megan, I have a question for you. Someone in the chat mentioned that they heard that caffeine and nicotine were chemicals produced by plants to protect themselves, of course, from being eaten or destroyed by animals. And so a student was wondering, is there a way that we can somehow program the unprotected seeds to produce chemicals like that to help protect them?
That's a really good question. And so I'm sure you could, because like we have the CRISPR technology and GMOs and all these other things, but it would be really difficult to do that actually, because if you did that, you would have to spend a lot of time in a lab, like working on genetics and like growing these seedlings and then transporting these seedlings and planting them in the forest and then making sure, taking care of them in the forest, things like that. And there are already other species that are growing these types of, they have those types of chemicals naturally. And instead of doing all that work to sort of create it as like a human sort of like modified thing, there are those types of trees already in the forest. It's just that they can't compete against the tree species that don't have that when there's more light. And so logging changes the forest so that those tree species are more likely to die, the ones that have chemicals and like caffeine and nicotine and stuff like that. And then the ones that don't take the time to produce chemicals, but they can grow up really fast, those are the ones that start, that sort of outcompete. So you could do all of this stuff, but it would take a lot of time and it would take a lot of money. And so then in terms of the sustainability of your logging company, you kind of have to weigh that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like it's almost like the plants would be preparing for something that's not their actual problem. So
exactly,
maybe not worth it in the long run. At least maybe worth it in the long run, but not in the short run.
That's exactly it. It's all a matter of the time scale that you're looking at.
All right. And one last question for both of you. And like I said, there were so many great questions put in the chat, but we only have time for two. So one last question for Andrew. You showed the wonderful robot legs that were made by the MIT professor. And some people were wondering, how does the brain communicate with robot arms or robot legs? Like, how does the robot know what to do?
Yeah, and that's a really great question that I could actually talk about as a presentation in and of itself. So there's a couple of different ways that the human body could typically communicate with what we would think to be a robot. The first would be something called EMGs, so electromyography. And then, so that is actually how that professor is communicating with his legs. So the way that works is there's actually these little patches, little stickers you could kind of think of. And what they do is they actually put them on the muscles of the residual limb, wherever the amputation is. And what these stickers do is they actually listen for the contraction or when the muscle actually becomes tense. And according to where you put these little stickers on the residual limb, you could usually put anywhere between 3 to 5. And it's always listening for how those muscles would want to react if the foot, in this case, was still there. So all they do is they put these stickers on the muscles and they listen for the impulses of the muscles, and then they take that information. They send it through wires to the robot, and the robot actually figures out in various ways how the motors in the foot should move. So this is one way of doing it. Another way that we won't get into, and I actually saw in the questions, people were asking about Neuralink, which is sort of a version of EEG, electroencephalography, which is actually reading brain waves. You could think of it as reading brain waves instead of reading muscle waves. So those are usually the two ways that you could communicate with a robot.
Wow, yeah, that definitely does sound like a whole another talk. And I'm sure there are wonderful videos online for people who are interested to learn more about it. And lastly, for Megan, I also have a final question for you about communication. So someone was really interested in your talk about how you marked trees that were affected with ticks in red. And they mentioned that in their town, they see a lot of pink trees. So what types of other forms of communication do you have to mark trees to, say something about the environment that they're in?
Yeah, I think that would really depend on who's marking them. So like in the logging concession where I work, they will mark trees that they want to cut with like certain patterns that are cut into them, or they will mark trees like they can add on markings. So like they'll have like 3 little marks if they want to cut it, and then a 4th mark if it's definitely going to be cut. But then if they have the 3 marks and they decide, oh, it actually looks like it has like a bad part in it, they'll make like an X slash so that they know not to cut it. So I think it really just depends on, who's managing these trees. But in a lot of urban areas, they will have people who monitor trees, like the growth rates every year, to see which trees are better suited to being street trees in different neighborhoods in different parts of the U.S. So maybe that could be something that's going on if that's something that you're seeing in your neighborhood.
Yeah, you made a really good point of the markings are really should be specific for who's looking at them. I know we heard earlier that Andrew is colorblind. And so a fun fact I learned once when I went to Disneyland was that when Disneyland was first being created, they had a bunch of trees and they tied a red ribbon around trees they wanted to keep and a green ribbon around trees they wanted to cut down. And the person bulldozed all of them. So if you're wondering why Disneyland does not have a lot of native trees, if you ever go one day, that is why. But anyways, once again, really great talk, both of you. I hope Andrew is not cutting down any of those trees with those markings. And we will go to Josie to hear the results.
All right, let's see. Are you guys ready? Ready to hear? Okay, so we have the results of the voting. I have it all tabulated. Can we get a drum roll, please? I would imagine you guys are all doing it. All right, I see a couple of people drum rolling. All right, we're gonna go through each question. So the first question we asked you was, how understandable was the presentation? And we wanted you to rank this on a 1 to 5. Megan, you got like an even 4. Fantastic. Andy, almost a 4.5. Unprecedented. Incredible. So now we're going on to question 2. We asked you guys, how much did this presentation spark your curiosity and imagination? And for this, Megan got a 3.5. That's all right. That's all right. But Andy came in at just above a 4. So he won this question too. Seems like we had maybe a little robot bias. For question 3, we asked you, how much more do you feel like you know about this topic now than you did before? Megan came in between a 3.5 and a 4, and Andy again right above a 4. So if we average all of these scores together to find out who our winner is, we have Andy. Congratulations. So if everyone can give a little bit of a round of applause for Andy, our robot winner.